Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's June 11th, and we have a lot to talk about. When I think about the email and the phone calls that I get from our listener community, and when I look at the total number of downloads for different episodes of Real Talk MS, well, it becomes pretty clear that stem cell therapy is an important topic for us to be talking about. And this past week, stem cell treatments were in the news for a few different reasons. There was the U.S. Federal District Court ruling that's going to have an impact on the hundreds of shady stem cell clinics that have popped up across the United States and the FDA's ability to regulate them. And two scientific breakthroughs were announced that could each have a significant impact on the future of stem cell therapy. We're going to be talking about all of this week's stem cell news in just a moment. It might surprise you to know that Canada has the highest per capita incidence of MS in the world. And the MS Society of Canada has responded by launching research initiatives on several different fronts. That's why I'm thrilled to have Dr. Karen Lee as my guest on the podcast. Dr. Lee is a vice president of research at the MS Society of Canada, and she's going to give us an update on some of the research projects that the MS Society of Canada is involved in, including a very big multi-year research undertaking that's focused on answering the questions, how and why does MS progress? And if you live in Canada and you happen to be listening to the podcast, you have an opportunity to participate in what's going to be a very significant research study that's setting out to answer some very big questions. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Karen Lee, there are a few other things that you should know about. As I mentioned at the top of today's podcast, stem cells were in the news this week, so let's start there. First, a United States federal judge ruled in favor of the FDA in its lawsuit against a company that operates stem cell clinics whose highly questionable treatments have blinded at least 4 patients. These so-called clinics, and the majority of the hundreds like them in the United States, claim that their unproven and unapproved treatments using stem cells that are derived from the patient's own fat cells can treat everything from arthritis to erectile dysfunction to Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, and other chronic conditions. Again, there's no scientific evidence that this type of stem cell treatment works. The only thing that we know it accomplishes is that it's enabled the owners of these fraudulent clinics to collect millions of dollars by offering false hope to people who are desperately searching for a cure. And I know that some of you listening have had this treatment, and others haven't had the treatment, but would like to believe that it works. So as gently as I can, I want to share 2 words with you. Placebo effect. And in case you aren't familiar with it, a placebo effect refers to a beneficial effect produced by a treatment due to the patient's belief in that treatment. The placebo effect has been demonstrated over and over again in multiple research studies. The most highly reported placebo effect studies are those where the study participants are told they're being given drinks that contain alcohol. The participants first act a little buzzed, and eventually, as they keep drinking, they appear to get drunk. Except for one thing. They haven't been given any alcohol at all. They get drunk on their own expectation. Make no mistake, the placebo effect is real and it's powerful. So before you send me that email explaining how stem cells derived from fat cells are actually effective in treating MS, please remember to cite the science that supports your belief. So getting back to this court decision, stem cell clinics offering this bogus treatment have relied on the fact that since the stem cells are derived from the patient's own fat cells, they aren't really producing a drug, and so the FDA has no authority to regulate the procedure. Well, the federal judge in this case ruled that the FDA has the authority to define this type of stem cell product derived from a patient's own fat cells as a drug product. And like all drug products, it requires FDA approval and compliance with all of the FDA rules. And while this court ruling involved a specific lawsuit with a specific company that operates 4 stem cell clinics, there are hundreds of shady clinics using this exact same model. So the court's ruling really authorizes the FDA to go after these clinics that make promises and charge thousands of dollars that insurance doesn't cover for a stem cell treatment that has no scientific foundation. And that's a huge win that's going to help protect the public from these kinds of con artists who don't seem to have any problem taking thousands of dollars from people and then delivering nothing in return. At the same time, this won't mean that these clinics will be shutting down. Now, I could make the argument that they should be shutting down, but there's just too much money at stake here. So we can expect to see this bogus procedure disappear, and we can also expect to see a new procedure take its place. Now, I think that it's highly likely that stem cell treatments will eventually be regulated. But society doesn't create the rules for any sort of new technology until after that new technology has been introduced. So today, here we are. And as a result of this court ruling, we're in a much better place when it comes to adding the first regulatory oversight to a shady industry that's literally been making it up as they go along. And if you'd like to review the FDA's announcement about the court decision, I'll include a link in today's show notes. And while I consider this to be very good news, when it comes to stem cell therapy, it wasn't the only good news this week. In fact, 2 scientific breakthroughs were announced, and each may have a positive impact on future stem cell therapy. And that's really important because at this early stage, the clinical trial results of legitimate stem cell therapy for treating MS and other neurodegenerative diseases, well, the results are promising, but they're mixed. Now, one of the breakthrough announcements comes from Harvard University, where a research team successfully edited the genes of stem cells while the cells were still in the body. In stem cell therapy, stem cells are removed from a patient's body, genetically altered, and then put back into their body. This is a complicated procedure that carries with it several points of potential failure. The stem cells can die in the culture dish. And once they've been transplanted, the altered stem cells may not be well tolerated by the patient's immune system, or they can just fail to fire up. So the Harvard research team loaded gene editing technology onto AAVs, which are a particular kind of virus that can get into the cells of mammals, but doesn't carry any disease. In this case, these AAVs carried a payload of gene editing technology, and the researchers used these AAVs to get into different types of skin, blood, and muscle stem cells in mice. And in order to see whether the procedure was effective, the stem cells were edited to activate genes that would actually glow a fluorescent red. And because of these reporter genes that glowed red, the research team was able to determine that 60% of the stem cells in skeletal muscle had been successfully edited, 27% of the skin stem cells had been successfully edited, and 38% of the bone marrow stem cells had been successfully edited. And if these percentages don't seem very impressive, well, they're extremely good for a first effort. And the research team was also able to observe that these changes in the edited stem cells were being passed on as these cells continued to divide and reproduce. This process could represent a major step forward in improving the efficacy of stem cell therapy by eliminating the need to remove stem cells from their natural environment in the patient's body. Well, obviously, there's lots more work to be done here, but this study represents a very promising start in a very positive direction. And if you'd like to review the details of this study, I'll include a link in today's show notes. Now, the other encouraging announcement involving stem cell research comes from the University of California, Irvine, where researchers developed a nanotechnology treatment from bone marrow stem cells that was successful in reversing multiple sclerosis symptoms in mice. Now, as a quick review, nanotechnology is a part of science and technology that involves controlling or manipulating matter at the atomic and molecular scale. We are talking smaller than small. In past experiments, bone marrow stem cells are harvested from a patient, activated with interferon gamma, which is an immune system protein, and then intravenously injected back into the patient. But a lot of these re-engineered stem cells fail to get through the blood-brain barrier, which is designed to protect our brain and spinal cord from invading cells. Well, the UCI research team was able to avoid this very significant obstacle by extracting nano-sized particles called exosomes from the stem cells and injecting them into mice carrying the mouse model of MS. These nanoparticles are small enough to pass through the blood-brain barrier, and once they did, the nerve damage that was caused by MS actually decreased, and the mice regained their lost motor skills. At the same time, these exosomes were able to normalize the immune systems in the mice, and that's something that conventional drug therapy can't do. I'll add my usual caveat here that there's a vast difference between the brain of a mouse and the brain of a human. But that shouldn't detract from the promising outcome of this study, and UCI is planning to test this nanotechnology in human trials next year. So we'll be keeping tabs on the research as it moves forward. And if you'd like to check out the details of the UCI study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Previously, scientists at Johns Hopkins developed a technique that uses stem cells to create actual models of the human brain in a petri dish. These lab-grown miniatures are called mini-brains, and because they mimic the cells and interactions that are found in human brains better than animal models can, mini-brains are a better way to study brain functions and carry out early-stage drug discovery research for neurological disorders like MS. Mini-brains are created from induced pluripotent stem cells. These are stem cells that have been genetically reprogrammed to return to their embryonic stem cell state. From there, researchers can stimulate the cells to grow into different cell types. Mini-brains take about 10 weeks to develop, and they actually closely resemble the brains found in developing fetuses. For MS research, it's worth noting that the nerve cells in these mini-brains can communicate with each other, sending electrical impulses from one cell to the next. And mini-brains can be customized to study specific neurological diseases like MS, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and others. Because these mini-brains are less expensive to maintain than even a lab rat, and they can mimic a human brain more closely than other animal models, they represent a cost-effective means of predicting human outcomes in clinical trials, which means they can help reduce the time and costs related to future MS drug discovery. And mini-brains are in the news this week because biotech company Axosim has acquired the exclusive rights to this mini-brain technology. And Axosim is licensing the technology as a research platform to other biopharmaceutical companies as a way for them to save time and money in early stage drug discovery and other research efforts. And as we're talking about research, a few weeks ago I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Karen Lee, the Vice President of Research for the MS Society of Canada. Canada has the highest per capita rate of MS in the world, and Dr. Lee and I spent a few minutes talking about some of the specific research that the MS Society of Canada is involved in, including a far-reaching, multi-year project designed to better understand how and why MS progresses. In a moment, you'll meet my guest, Dr. Karen Lee. Canada has one of the highest MS rates in the world. And you've heard me say before that one of the really great things about coming to an International Progressive MS Alliance meeting is that I have the opportunity to sit across the table from people that I don't always get the chance to sit across the table from. Right now, I'm sitting across the table from Dr. Karen Lee, the Vice President of Research at the MS Society in Canada and a member of the Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lee.
Thank you, John. I'm glad to be here.
So toward the end of 2018, the MS Society of Canada came out with some specific recommendations about vitamin D for people living with MS. Why was it important to publish recommendations about vitamin D?
So it was really important for us to publish some recommendations on vitamin D because anytime we posted anything on vitamin D, we automatically got asked, how much should I be taking? There isn't consistency in terms of the amount people living with MS should be taking. At the same time, people were concerned if they had it, what should their family members be taking? Could they potentially be affected? And we also noticed the neurology community, for people that were treating MS patients, really were also inconsistent in what they were recommending. So we decided to pull an international group together to provide some advice and also to look at the current literature and evidence to understand what should be the recommendations on vitamin D.
While we're talking about some recent activity, also, I think around the same time in December, you announced a partnership with Brain Canada and pharmaceutical company Biogen to launch the Canadian Proactive Cohort Study for people living with MS, more popularly known as CanPro-Co. And recently, I know pharmaceutical company Roche has also joined the effort. Can you tell us a little bit about what sounds like a really significant project?
Yeah, so this is a massive project that we thought was really important to have in Canada as having one of the highest rates in the world. One of the big questions we're all asking, not only in Canada, but worldwide, why does progression happen? Why do people have relapsing remitting MS and then all of a sudden there's that changeover and they get progressive MS? What are some of the markers and clues that we could potentially find to potentially understand why people progress in their disease? And so in conversations with multiple partners you talked about, they really thought it was a great idea to really study people living in Canada. So taking their clinical information, their MRI data, some sampling from themselves, such as biospecimens, such as blood, to really then study in depth what is going on when it comes to progression. And so the lead investigator is Dr. Ji Wan-Oh out of St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and she and a team of collaborators across Canada will be looking in depth at patients across Canada to really understand why is progression happening in patients.
That sounds like a really ambitious project. How long do you think this project is going to go on for? How much study is going to be happening?
So obviously, progression doesn't happen overnight, unfortunately, or fortunately. But one of the things that is going to be important is that we are really looking at this over many, many years. Currently, the funding is for 5 years. The intent is that this becomes the sampling that they collect, the data that they collect becomes an open source that other researchers can then also dive into to study, because everyone's going to have their different questions. And so what this group is really doing is really collecting the data and then over time starting to really analyze it. We hope that over the next 5 years, some data will come through and provide some research answers. For instance, in Canada, we have the opportunity to probe some healthcare data. So there is a project specifically in this study that's going to be looking at retrospective retrospective healthcare data in specific provinces in Canada and trying to understand potentially getting clues on progression there. And more importantly, what's the health economic impact of having progression? And I think those are some of the big questions that are being asked beyond just the biological questions that we have.
So are you still recruiting for participants in the study? And if you are, where can people go to find out more?
So we are recruiting. They are recruiting in Canada. They just opened recruitment sites across Canada. I just heard that they have about 70 patients already recruited. They are looking for 1,000. So I really highly recommend all your Canadian listeners to go onto the MS Society website. You will see there's a CanPro Co section under research, and you will be able to find if your city does indeed have a site for enrollment, and do encourage you to see if you can apply and be part of this very great initiative.
Well, I can only add that being a part of research is in itself a really empowering step to take.
Yeah, I think it's a really great way for people to potentially be part of the solution. At the same time, I know this group of researchers who are leading CanPro Co are going to be looking at ways to have more interaction than just having the person come into the clinic. They will be getting updates and kind of seeing the progress of research, so you can get live updates before anyone else. So that could also be an advantage. But I think one of the big pieces is that we can't do this alone. As we see here in the Alliance, and your involvement as well, John, as somebody who has experience in having a loved one living with MS, your contribution is also highly important, because we need to have that engagement. It's not just about the researchers, it's about involving the community at whole to solve the problems.
If you're listening and you're living in Canada, I hope you visit the MS Society's website, go to the CanPro Co section, and please go ahead and sign up and see if you can't be a participant in something that sounds like it's going to be talked about for a really long time. You know, while we're talking, I know that the MS Society of Canada has recently become an investor in cannabis research. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So we are actually partnering with our government funding agency, which is the Canadian Institute of Health Research, to fund research in cannabis. One of the things that we also have heard from the communities, people are using medical cannabis, and one of the big things is we aren't able to give enough information about the pros and cons about using cannabis. We hear that it is definitely helping people alleviate pain, spasticity, anxiety, issues that they might have. But one of the things as researchers, we understand how is it doing that, and potentially are there side effects. We know there's other disease states that are using medical cannabis to alleviate different symptoms. What is interesting here in MS is that cannabis could potentially affect cognition. And as we know, people living with MS already probably have a deficit in cognition. So we really need to understand that layering by having cannabis there. How else is it potentially contributing to the function of your brain?
It's kind of interesting. It's like plugging one hole in the dike, perhaps, and seeing a new leak spring out somewhere else that you need to think about before you determine whether a treatment's going to really be overall more helpful or not so much helpful for someone.
Yeah, and I think ultimately what we want to do is it's really up to the person living with MS to make their own decisions. So we as an organization just want to ensure we're giving you the evidence to make that decision for yourself. And so right now there isn't enough cannabis research out there. And that's why we thought it was really important to partner with the Canadian Institute of Health Research on this initiative.
Well, something I talk about on the podcast all the time is that people need to be informed medical consumers so that they can make decisions in their own best interest, and they can be part of the overall treatment conversation, whether it's with their neurologist or any other specialist they might be seeing, to be a part of that. And you can really only be an effective participant if you've done your homework. So it's great that you're going to create resource that will allow people to better understand the pros, cons, and make the choices that they feel most comfortable with.
Definitely. I think that is very important. I think as we communicate research in a better way to people who don't have a medical or research background, the more informed they are, and really that they feel empowered about their decision making. And I think that's the ultimate piece we want for our community.
So if I can add a detail here, one of the great ways I think you're personally doing that is when people visit the MS Society Canada website, not only will they get all of the information and resources that you would expect to find, but they're also going to find your blog, which does a wonderful job of breaking down a lot of what's going on in the science into easier to understand, easy to digest pieces so that everybody can really get it and feel much more engaged and understand what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think for many, many years, a lot of us as scientists and researchers felt we didn't really need to communicate in an effective way. And it was, I think for many people, it was a black hole. And it was just like, just trust the people in the research community. But I think one of the things is that we as researchers actually gain more by communicating research in an effective way. Because by us talking about the research, we can then have real conversations with people who are impacted by the disease and get their input. I think that's the ultimate piece. It's not about just about us talking about and informing people. It's also then we can have conversations. And I think ultimately by having those conversations, we can then, once again, if we go back, be all part of the solution, and it's not just one group.
I think that whether it's the vitamin D recommendations, this massive study that is just getting off the ground, CanPro-Co, or the latest investment partnership in exploring cannabis research, you guys have a lot on your plate. Anything else going on? I don't imagine you have time for a lot more, but is anything else going on research-wise?
There's always tons of research stuff coming through. I think one of the key pieces, obviously we're here for the International Progressive MS Alliance that we're a proud member of, but we're always trying to understand what the hot topics are in our community. And then from there, trying to design out new programs and really ultimately making that big step, which is to end multiple sclerosis.
For which all we can say is thank you for that. And thanks for talking to me today.
Thanks, John. It was a pleasure.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. I want to thank those of you who've taken the time to email or call me with your feedback and suggestions for future podcast episodes. If you haven't done that yet, please consider this your invitation to join the Real Talk MS conversation. You can get in touch by using the Contact Us page at the Real Talk MS website, which you'll find at realtalkms.com, or you can email me at john@realtalkms.com. That's JON@realtalkms.com. Or you can leave a message on our listener hotline. I set up a dedicated phone line to make it as easy as possible for you to connect with me in the podcast. Just call area code 310-526-2283 in the United States and share your thoughts. So whether you choose to shoot me an email or make a phone call, I hope you'll get in touch and join our conversation. Not only do I take your feedback and suggestions to heart, but I do my best to reply to every email message that I receive. So I hope to hear from you soon. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.